I'm sure you all know the old conundrum. What came first? The chicken or the egg, right? Well, we're going to leave that discussion of that particular puzzle for biology class. But this morning I want to explore a similar question. What comes first? Faith or works? That is, do our outer actions flow from a pre-existing inner disposition, or do our actions shape and build our faith? I think commonly we assume that faith has the priority, that faith comes first, and then our actions grow out of and flow from our faith. If I can get my mind right, in other words, then the appropriate actions will follow. And if there's something wrong with my behavior, then there must be some mistaken ideas back there somewhere in the past that are causing the problem, and if I can correct those, then my behaviors will fall in line. James, however, complicates this simple progression in our passage for today. And so I want us to hear James chapter 2, verses 14 to 26, as James imagines a dialogue about faith and works. What good is it, he asks, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Can that kind of faith save them? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, eat your fill," but you do not give them what the body needs, what good is it? So also, faith, if it does not have works, is dead being by itself. But someone will say, right, this guy right up in the front, he'll say, right, "Show me your faith and I'll show you my works." No. You show me your faith without works and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. Well and good. Even demons believe that, and they tremble with fear. But you would like evidence, you empty fellow, that faith without works is useless? All right then. Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith was working together with his works, and his faith was perfected by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, "Now Abraham trusted God, and it was counted to him for righteousness." And he was called God's friend. And so you see that a person is justified by works, not by faith alone. Similarly, was not Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another way? For you see that just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. Now, to understand what James is saying, I think we're going to need to address the flexibility of the term faith in this passage. In the 12 verses that we just heard, the same Greek word is translated at least 3 different ways in most English translations. You might get something like faith, or belief, or trust. And I think that the flexibility of that concept is actually part of James's concern. It's a far bridge, in other words, between believing something in your head and trusting that with your whole person. And James knows that you can believe many truths about God and yet not follow and trust Him. Witness the demons. And in the letter as a whole, James seems concerned that his audience has failed to cross that bridge from faith as an intellectual assent to ideas about God to faith as trusting and following God with the whole person, mind, soul, and body. So how do you get across that bridge? Well, James provides a couple of examples, right, to make his point. First, he points us to our father Abraham. God chose Abraham and promised to give him innumerable descendants through which God would bless all nations. But then, when Abraham, an old man, miraculously had a son with his, up till then, barren wife, Sarah, God told Abraham to do a horrifying thing. He called Abraham to sacrifice his son on an altar, just as if he were livestock of some kind. You can read the whole troubling story in Genesis chapter 22. And so, does Abraham merely believe in this God and his promises, or does he trust them with his whole person? In the story, of course, Abraham proves willing to sacrifice his son, going as far as binding Isaac on the altar and taking the knife in his hand before God intercedes and stops him. In one sense, Abraham's actions verify his ultimate faith in God. He trusted that God could fulfill his promise to make him a father of many descendants, even if he asked Abraham to do something that threatened that very promise. That's what, at first blush, maybe, this seems to reinforce our common understanding of the relationship between faith and works. Abraham has faith in God, and that faith leads to actions that verify his faith is radical trust rather than simply intellectual assent. But James doesn't let us off that easy. James complicates matters when he says things like, you see that his faith was working together with his actions, and his faith was perfected by his actions, his works. According to James, Abraham's radical act was more than an expression of his faith. It somehow works with, it somehow perfects that faith. And so he can conclude by asserting, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Now, at the end of this section, James summarizes this point with an SAT-style analogy. You all remember how these work, I assume, right? As X is to Y, so Z is to, right? You've got to fill in the blank with something, right? Well, I'll give you an example, right? As the Kansas City Chiefs are to the NFL, so the ACU Wildcats are to the NCAA, right? Is this a good analogy, SAT-style analogy? This is, in fact, what James does. I know you thought maybe that you'd never need to know how to do analogies like that again after you finish the SAT. Who knew that it might actually help you understand the New Testament? In the last verse of this section, we see James making just such an analogy. But if we're not paying close attention, we're going to assume that we know where he's going with this analogy. We're going to incorrectly fill it in, and we'll miss his point. James begins with the first half of the analogy. For as the body without the spirit is dead. Right? That's our comparison point. What's the relationship between body and spirit? I think we know, right? The body depends on the spirit for life. Otherwise, it's nothing but an empty, lifeless shell. The spirit enlivens the body. And so if we start with this analogy and we apply it to the question of faith and works, how might we do that? Maybe we'd say something like, as the body is made alive by the Spirit, so also works are made alive by faith. Faith gives life to works. That's how we do it, right? And sometimes we're so sure that that's exactly where James is going that we actually miss what he says. For as the body without the Spirit is dead, James tells us, so also faith without works is dead. Did you see it? He flips our expectations. As he has set up the analogy, the body corresponds to faith, and the Spirit corresponds to works. Just as the body is a lifeless shell without the Spirit, so also faith is just a lifeless shell without works. Now, James's second example of faith also, I think, surprises us, maybe as much as his analogy. He points our attention to Rahab the prostitute. You may know her story from Joshua chapter 2. Rahab was a prostitute in Jericho, and when spies from Israel came in to town and stayed with her, she protected them, even when the king of Jericho demanded that she hand them over. She defied her king, hid the spies, and snuck them safely out of the city. Now, by citing Rahab as an example, I think James emphasizes for us that the works that he's concerned about, the works that justify, are not a list of morally appropriate behaviors. Rahab, as a prostitute, would have a hard time checking off items in such a list of moral uprightness, I think. By the way, we should note, so would Abraham. And so when James says that Rahab was justified by works, he isn't saying that she gave up all the vices and followed all the commands and earned her way into God's people. That would be a misreading of James. So what is her justifying work? What is it that she does? It's an act of risky hospitality. She risked her own well-being to care for a couple of vulnerable people in need. And this justifies her, James says. With this example, I think it's a little harder for us to argue that faith precedes or gives rise to works. Was it faith in God that motivated Rahab's action in this story? If you read the story from Joshua 2, it's clear that Rahab has heard about the military success of Israel that they have recently enjoyed, and she attributes their success to the power and intervention of their God, and so she makes a choice. I don't want to be on the wrong side of that people. But at least at this point, her actions are motivated by shrewd self-preservation rather than deep understanding of and faith in the God of Israel. She hardly knows him. But it's just enough. Just enough to prompt an act of risky hospitality. And this work, this act of burgeoning trust, plants a seed that can grow into robust faith. So which came first? Faith or works? Well, it's complicated. Maybe it's more like the chicken and egg quandary than we initially thought. Abraham certainly believed things about God before he offered his son on the altar. And surely he trusted him in an incomplete and imperfect way before he obeyed. But it's also true that his act confirmed, reinforced, grew, and gave life to that burgeoning faith. You see that his faith was working together with his works, James says, and his faith was perfected by his works. So rather than a linear progression from faith to works, or from works to faith for that matter, James imagines something more like a repeating, self-reinforcing feedback loop. Abraham trusted God just enough to leave home when God called, and God's providence for him during his wandering reinforced, grew, enlivened that faith. And this strengthened faith then was just enough to prompt him to take the next risky act of trust, offering his son on an altar. Imperfect belief can prompt acts of trust that build and give life to deeper faith, and that then can prompt acts of greater risk and vulnerability, and so on as God forms us into the image of his Son, as God grows us into lives of complete self-emptying love, which is the flourishing life that he has intended for us from the very beginning. And so how do we cross this bridge from belief, intellectual assent, to ideas about God, to robust faith, following and trusting God in lives of self-emptying love? Here I think we can come back to James's comical scenario that opens this section of the letter. Imagine the friend at your door, poorly clothed and lacking daily food. What do? I'll pray for you, just won't cut it, James says. They need clothes and food, not prayers and well wishes. Now, of course, you also need clothes and food to survive. Can you take the risk of giving those things up to help a person in need? In the opening of his letter, James says that God is the giver of all good gifts, and he gives generously to all without changing. You believe those words, I'm sure. Maybe you even repeat them to others. But do you really trust that it's true? Do you really trust that that's who God is? Can you really trust him? Or do you need to cling to the things that you have as a backup security plan? Do you have that kind of faith that can let go? Probably not. I know I don't. And we won't, James says. We won't be able to cross the bridge from belief to faith, from intellectual assent to trust, until we take a risk. And as if we really believe it's true, empty ourselves, even just a little bit, in love for another. If we don't do that, our faith will remain an empty, lifeless shell. If we do, however, we might just find that in the end, we aren't empty after all, but enlivened with the abundant life of the Spirit of God. And that's my challenge for us this week. Because of who God is, the unchanging, generous giver, we are freed to give freely. Find a concrete, specific situation where you can risk the vulnerability of emptying yourself in love for another person. And then do it. Your faith isn't perfect. Your work won't be perfect either. But do it and watch how God enlivens the body of your faith with the spirit of your works, bringing you and those you help into the flourishing life He intends for His children. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. Now, those of you who are guests with us this morning, you're invited to stay in your seats and you'll receive some instructions right after our students have been dismissed. Students, you're dismissed. Go in peace, keep warm, and eat well.